Bonjour à tous et donc bienvenue à cette session.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this panel, which is the world after. This could be the theme of this entire rencontre, in fact, because everybody is thinking about the world of tomorrow. And we're going to this in particular, and we're going to look forward in a positive way to what is going to happen. We have Patrick Artus has emphasized all of the dangers that threaten us, excess debt, climate disruption, and we're going to try to look at this in a positive way. We'll see if we can succeed in persuading you that it's a positive thing. So talk to us around Patricia Barbizet, who's the associate member of the Cercle des Économistes, who's going to be moderating this discussion. We have Anne Dessine, who is a professor at the University of Paris-Nanterre, Olivier Girard, President of France and Benelux for Accenture, Dominique Grieve, who will be joining us from the UK, former Attorney General. We have John Caillou, President of Thayer Mayan and Institute for Large-Scale Innovation, joining us from California. Is that right? Then we have Georges Terrier, who's an attorney, who will be joining us face-to-face. And then we have Oliver Wilde, President of Amraye. I think, Patricia, we have been through all of the panelists, and so we can start our discussion. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to see you all here again for the Rencontre économique of Aix-en-Provence. We're going to talk about the world after. So what will the world be like tomorrow? Victor Hugo, in his long poem, The Song of the Dusk, tried to give us an answer. We hope we've not got to dusk yet. We have this is a difficult thing to do, to predict the world of tomorrow rather than to look back on what happened yesterday. We're going to take up this challenge, and to do that we have to look in the long term. What are the current changes, and will these continue in the future? And what will be the next changes in the world? Of course, this is made even more difficult by the health crisis and by doubts we might have about the resilience of our societies and the role of economy and of public authorities. These are called into question, and the combination of national sovereignty and international cooperation. This has been called into question as well. And at the same time, we have to talk about the collective capacity to adapt, which has been very impressive indeed. If we're talking about individual mobilization, this has enabled us to overcome this pandemic, almost. The scientific excellence of certain stakeholders in the health sector have made it possible to develop vaccines in unheard of timescales. The means of communication have been transformed in the long term in just a few weeks. And in the book of the history of the world, we are going to turn the page of this pandemic and look to the world after. The world after will no doubt be characterized by more turbulence and more change. Demography, economics, climate, and also science and technology, all of these areas will undergo tremendous upheavals. And these are underlying trends of change, the scale of which has been revealed or accentuated by the health crisis. Because of the effect of these changes, the world tomorrow will be under greater tension, and there will be greater divisions. Environmental factors will be creating more tension. The increased competition to gain access to resources such as water or rare metals will perhaps lead to local or international crises. So the page is not blank, and some commentators are describing extremely dark chapters in our future world. But we have to maintain hope and not be too catastrophic in our thinking. I'm sure our colleagues here will give us the capacity to fashion this future world. The major advances of science and technology will contribute to the well-being of our societies. They will accelerate communication, they will support economic growth, and will favor the well-being of humanity. If we imagine future changes, these will transform the world of business, so they will be able to be better integrated into the ecological, environmental, and social environment. By rethinking the functioning of our democracies, we'll be able to ensure they are long-standing and robust. In one word, let's put science and innovation and technical process at the service of human development. Let's draw the world of tomorrow that we want to see. The new generations haven't waited for the health crisis to start a major revolution. Previously, this is only restricted to communication, but environmental and social change is now a structural part of companies' DNA. Civil society, for its part, is mobilizing to strengthen the role of commons. To limit turbulence, governments must also institutionalize their cooperation. More than that, we can count on the generation that has grown up during the pandemic to accelerate change to the world of tomorrow. The awareness, especially environmental awareness, is intensifying, and in young people, it has been transformed into a profound desire for change. The vision of this young generation engaged in the construction of the new world will play a vital role. The world of tomorrow is both light and dark, but above all, it requires us to make a common commitment. The responsibility of tomorrow's world will be the responsibility of today's younger generation. So, to contribute to building this world of tomorrow in this context of deregulation and upheaval, our guests are going to answer a series of questions. First of all, are we ready for the world of tomorrow? John Keogh will explain why it is necessary to overcome the desire for comfort and nostalgia for the past in order to project ourselves into the world of tomorrow that we want to build. Patricia, we'll move straight on to John Keogh. We're running a little bit late, and we're going to ask John Keogh that question directly. I'll ask the second question afterwards. Yes, please. Yes. John.
Well, I think there are many questions on the table, the overarching one being how do we define the world after? And I think we have to acknowledge that that definition is really quite elusive, that we're in an era of great uncertainty and that it requires from us a new set of mental and managerial and leadership proficiencies in order to successfully navigate this rather unprecedented situation that we find ourselves in, this global pandemic, which in some respects has had the effect of uniting humanity around a common cause, or at least pointing out where the gaps are in terms of our ability to function as a global civil society. I make a fundamental distinction between disruption and discontinuity. It's very common these days to refer to the times as disrupted. But I think that really we need a different lens. It's sort of like the sailors in the 17th century coming out of Lisbon and heading west in search of pepper and treasure of one kind or another. If you think about the world in terms of disruption, as a sailor, you want the seas to calm down. You want to restore stability. You want to improve your sea skills, and you want to be able to be courageous and flexible. But if you look at the world in terms of discontinuity, it's kind of like the old sea maps where they end in the middle of the ocean. And sometimes the legend is, beyond here lie sea monsters. And I think that we are in an era of discontinuity where major questions like how higher education should work and what is the nature of the labor force and how do we satisfy ourselves as humans in terms of our social interaction and many other fundamental aspects of society have been called into question by the pandemic at the same time as technological innovation and the massive influx of venture capital, which continues to try to revolutionize workflow and learning and how we spend our time, are very much a force in the world right now. So I look at this notion of readiness for what I call the reemergence, or what we might call the reemergence, as having three broad categories in a sense. I think that there's no doubt that many of us will engage in the world through the lens of nostalgia. You know, we will want to go back to our favorite restaurant. We will want to go back to, you know, many people in America have postponed their trip to Disneyland, and they now want to go, and they want to get back to their familiar patterns. And, you know, obviously nostalgia is a powerful force. It has both kind of a way of satisfying human needs, but also certain limitations. The second and more, I think, significant and also potentially hazardous response is what I call delusion. It's very common that anthropologists will look at societies under stress and begin to see that delusional thinking provides an explanation of the universe, which, while delusional, also provides reassurance and explanation. And I think we see this around the world in various political phenomena. I won't get into the great details about that, but simply asserting a delusional set of ideas in order to solve the problems of creating definitions is a dead end for sure. And then the final response is what I would call the heroic response, which is we have a crisis, but as we know, the cliche of looking at Chinese characters, Chinese ideograms, is that the word for crisis and the word for opportunity are extremely entwined. So how do we honor the entrepreneurs and the innovators and the pioneers who are going to make change and who are going to make new things happen? To do this, we need a new set of proficiencies. We need the emotional maturity to understand that anxiety, the kind of anxiety we might feel about the uncertainty and the disruption, in a psychological sense, the flip side of anxiety is excitement. And that if we can mobilize our excitement and add a soupçon of optimism coupled with new proficiencies, we will be ahead of the game. So some of these proficiencies, I've written about this as the 6 intelligences for navigating in a time of discontinuity, are context intelligence, understanding the truth of your current situation and the vibrancy of where you want to go, moral intelligence, which is how to be driven by purpose, human intelligence, which is mobilizing the generations and the diverse workforce, generative intelligence, which is mobilizing the power of human creativity, technological intelligence, because in these times, AI and data science potentially change everything, hopefully for good. And then finally, transformational intelligence, to have a theory of change that enables individuals, teams, organizations, nations, and global civil society to make the transition to something of a desired future. So there's a lot to unpack here in terms of the reemergence. I think the key is that the game board has been shaken up, and it provides both a certain amount of anxiety, but also the opportunity to really define radical new pathways.
Thank you, John.
So thank you. I'll pause there.
Thank you. Patricia, la question pour Anne.
Merci. Alors,
Question for Anne. Thank you, John. Thank you very much. How is the US becoming involved in the world after? Yes, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you face to face, and thank you, Jean Hervé and the organizers for organizing this. The United States are faced with a specific problem. They don't have the pre-COVID, they also have to deal with after Trump as well as after COVID. This has considerably disrupted the country internally, not only concerning the functioning of institutions, but as we know, with the role of the United States on the international level. I'll try to show that Biden is not perhaps the preferred candidate that everybody has. His opponent called him Sleepy Joe. For the time being, Joe Biden has not made any major mistakes because he's understood that he has to take strong action. After 40 years of Republican propaganda and Republican politics, which have been based first and foremost on the suspicion that we have in the Constitution about the federal level, the new states were very much afraid that the federal level would take power over the individual states in the US. This fear exists. And the Republicans, especially over the last 40 years, but already with Nixon, had already started to treat as the same way suspicion for the federal level, saying we can have tax reductions and we need to strangle all the ministries and agencies and reduce them all as far as possible, especially, this is something we haven't seen for a long time, but we're now accepting, especially if these ministries and agencies are in charge of distributing social programs and social assistance, which are beneficial to the minorities, to the black community. And then we have the racist component, which has been in existence for a long time, which was highlighted by many candidates, by Sarah Palin, when she was the vice president of candidate for the previous election. And then it was also praised by Donald Trump. This Republican propaganda for over the last 40 years has shown, however, that they presented the federal state as being the public enemy #1. This is shown in opinion polls. We need to distinguish between Republican politicians, which is 99% are against the federal state, and also we have the Republican voters who are starting to think that maybe the federal state could do something for them. The result of this propaganda is also that Republicans do not believe or pretend not to believe in climate change. That is another revolution, because we have to remember that Nixon, he is the one who created the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Over the years, with the propaganda of the free radios since the 1980s in the US, there's no longer what we call the fairness doctrine. We have equal time. Republican radio can talk complete rubbish for 24 hours a day without the equivalent of without any agency being able to say this is the case. And also 70% of Republican voters are convinced that Trump won the last election. So it's in this context that Joe Biden has to take action. And what stems from this context is a very unequal kind of capitalism, this inegalitarian capitalism without any social safety net, as was said earlier. The shock of the crisis was much greater in the US because you don't have all the social mechanisms that we have in Europe. And I don't have time to talk about this, but there's a political system which was no longer enforcing the law, was no longer enforcing antitrust legislation or anything else. So Biden is aware of this quintuple emergence: health, economic, social, democratic also. And this is the link with his foreign policy. If he wants to restore the role of the American state in the international order and in the multilateral approach, he has to show that the state is functioning in the US and democracy is functioning in the US. And that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of internal obstacles and barriers, in particular obstacles due to the political system with the federalism. The federated states are very powerful, and when they are in the hands of the Republicans, they do everything they can to work against Biden. For example, in Florida, the governor has banned restaurants and cruise operators from forcing people to wear a mask or to have a health pass. Not a good idea, but we can't do anything about it. All of the legislation also to restrict voting and to prevent people from voting. Then also in terms of checks and balances, the Senate, because of the filibuster rule, which means 40 Republicans block all of Biden's plans, whether it's for reform of the police or immigration. For me personally, if we accept, apart from the defense sector, I think that Europe has an interest in America playing a stronger role. And what we saw in the minimum tax, which we've seen recently, is no doubt a good idea, but let's not be naive. Remember that America First didn't start with Donald Trump. The Americans always defend their interests. They don't hesitate to spy on us. This has been Echelon and PRISM. And they use legislation as a weapon, in particularly the extraterritorial application of their boycott law and their antitrust legislation. Thank you very much. Well, let's say with Biden, they're doing it in a more elegant way, could we say? Yes. For example, if the agreement with Iran emerges once more, we will be able to recover everything we have in the Iran market. Okay, we're going to the UK now. Dominic Grieve, former Attorney General of the government. What will be the role of the UK in this new world after Brexit, do you think? Thank you very much, Patricia. It's obvious that in the United Kingdom, the world after, it will be the world after Brexit. The debate is continuing about the role of the United Kingdom on the world level. Even though people who voted to stay have voted to leave Europe, they share their point of view on the future, and especially about artificial intelligence and high-tech and the need to modernize. What is not clear at all is where the debate is going to lead to in terms of the alignment of the UK, either with the European Union, our European neighbours, or a demand to take to the seas and to trade with Australia, to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and to abandon regulations which were originally made it possible to join the European Union, and to do something completely different, to do a trade deal with the United States as well as Australia. The interesting thing is that this debate also creates a division between people who voted to leave the European Union. People in my former party, the Conservative Party, in that party you have very many people that share this opinion, and this has been demonstrated and shown particularly with the recent trade deal we're trying to set up with Australia, and what will happen to British agriculture as a result. Not only for agriculture, but also for preservation of the environment. So at the moment, this conundrum has not been resolved, and it's difficult to see what is going to happen in the future. Perhaps there are a few clues, perhaps. The first is that our partnership with Europe remains very important for us. So it's difficult to see why the alignment we have, and which we are keeping at the moment with most of the European regulations, will be easy to get rid of. Except perhaps for the financial sector, which is demanding equivalence with the rest of Europe. Secondly, from the point of view of our security, Europe is a very important zone for us. We can see this with our partnership with our defense partnership with France, that this is absolutely vital for our common future. And this will be maintained very well, despite the fact that President Macron and Prime Minister Johnson do not understand or get on very well together. I have the impression that the debate will be less revolutionary than one might expect, and that it will come back that John Cowell will mentioned. How are we going to make a living? How are we going to prevent immigration being unacceptable for the population, but for it to be sufficient to maintain economic development? And also, how are we going to use our influence, if we have any, in the world, to achieve the effects that we want to see for us and that are beneficial for us and for our neighbours? And to look at this question, this debate is tearing the United Kingdom apart. The biggest problem is that maybe we won't have a United Kingdom at all, but with England and Scotland separating, this is a debate where I cannot tell you what is going to happen. But I think even if we remain, if we just have England instead of being the United Kingdom, even then we will still have a partnership with Europe, selling our champagne-made wine in the South Downs. And thanks to climate change, we'll be able to make even better champagne than you have in France, I'm sure. Well, not sure about that. Maybe. We'll see. Thank you, Dominic. We'll come and have a drink with you in a while. OK, we'll look at the business world now and also look at the technological transformations. Olivier, what are the major technological, scientific and digital trends that are going to have an impact on our societies and companies tomorrow? Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Christophe. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Before we talk directly about these trends in the second part, I would like to look at the point as to whether we are at a tipping point or are we already in the world after. There are three elements that make me think we're already in the world after. As Patricia mentioned, we have the incredible quality of the recovery plans, the awareness of companies and all of us as consumers and employees and citizens, and what I call the promises that have been kept by science and technology. I'll come back to those. The recovery plans, you'll go through that very quickly. You know the figures in billions, several hundred millions have been invested in the US and in Europe too. What I think is most important is the speed of reaction more than the actual volume. And these recovery plans are focusing on the right subjects. The two most important transitions, ecological and digital transition. The second point is this double realization. Today, 50% of the most important companies in France have carbon neutral objectives between 2030 and 2040. Is that enough? I'm not the best judge of that. Is it much more than before? Yes, it is, a great deal more. They're much more ambitious now than they were before. In the same way, my company and other companies too are looking at their responsibility in a completely different way. And the awareness is much greater than before. 15 million people in Europe are going to be trained in new technologies. For us, this is 300 out of 350 million employees in the world have been trained in these technologies. The interesting thing is not looking after ourselves. We have to go beyond our borders. We go back to encourage people to become involved and to develop these new sectors above and beyond the world of business itself. I won't talk further about our own realization as in the post-pandemic situation where we want to consume more responsibly and have a more societal way of consuming. All of the studies confirm that, and the post-pandemic studies, particularly the last point, which makes me sure we are already in this world after, is that the promises have been kept by science technology. As a man of technology, working for a technological company, I very clearly understand that technology could have been a bit disappointing sometimes. But this time, I think we haven't said this enough during this crisis. This time, technology has enabled us to find solutions. And this is what I call the majority of the triptych, the three aspects: cloud, cybersecurity, and home working tools, and collaboration. Maybe everybody's a little bit sick of that one at the moment, but this is how French economy has gone into maturity. 30% of the French economy last year from one day to the next. Absolutely incredible. 30% of the French economy was working through digital technology. Without that, the crisis would have been much worse. The continuity of services provided the government, by institutions and by companies would have been much more difficult to accomplish. To talk more about the world after, I think there are three elements. There will be more governance, more rules, and this is an opportunity for Europe. And a return to profound transformation. I'm talking about products and services and the innovations. We've come from California, which are often based on experience. The race to have as least a few clicks as possible, whether for cars or for the hydrogen plants of tomorrow, which will be much more revolutionary for the world. And finally, I believe very much in the keeping of promises by science and technology. This is the reason for that Accenture, my company, exists. A very nice reason to exist. Yes, thank you. During this crisis, we have discovered the importance of risk and the fear of risk and the management of risk. Patricia.
It's Oliver that will explain, in fact, how can we capture the future by taking risk or win for the future, taking into account stakeholders and organizing technically and financially enterprises, their flexibility, their reactivity, so that we reach a balance of the sharing of the risks that is different. Hello, everybody. Thank you. I chair La Marée, which is the professional association that brings together all the professions of risk management in enterprises of all sizes, small, medium, and large. To react on the subject of innovation, I'll talk about risk, because innovation cannot take place without taking risks. The post-crisis recovery cannot take place without taking risks, and the development of new models must be based on taking risks, because all the former models, we saw that with the crisis, were crash tested and did not necessarily resist, and will probably not resist to the future crisis. But I insist on the fact that risk is not a bad word or an obstacle. On the contrary, What is a bad word is the ignored risk and being afraid of risk. Being afraid of risks will probably kill economic recovery and innovation. And it would make us it would stop us from being able to adapt to the stakes of the world of the future. Either because you will do the same mistakes over and over again, or by fear. And fear, we saw what that can do, and this would lead to isolate us and turn to ourselves, or by the lack of a sense of responsibility. And again, expecting that the state takes care of everything and solves everything would lead us to a risk management without anticipating and with decisions that have heavy consequences and that will continue with time. And all these behaviors are not good for innovation. Worse even is when risks are not properly managed or ill-managed. We see the advent of punishing rules, and I think the encouragement is much better. If we take example, I said on Ostley, did that enable to reduce fraud? Will the green taxing, does it accompany ecological transition? Maybe there are better innovative ways better suited ways to act and giving more leeway to enterprises to take care of these issues. So there's no real building of new models without the basis of risk management and a good management of risk. What is it? First of all, it's identifying, assessing its own risks and impacts. In a second position, there's the strategy of limiting or reducing the risk thanks to prevention, the capacity to adapt. And in there, I include crisis management, a quick startup after a stress or a shock, and in third position, the capacity to finance this risk. And with this triptych, which is shared, known, very transparent, we can more easily take risks and bring our teams on board and our shareholders. Enterprises and states that have proven to be good risk managers with a mature risk management, have proven to be flexible, robust, and they manage to navigate inside the crisis. And with risk management, we develop economic fabric that is at the same time responsible and sustainable. And I see the commitments that were taken by some big enterprises like Veolia, for example. During the crisis, we implemented a sanitary system that was very robust, that reassured our collaborators and able to maintain the continuity of our activity, to keep them at the office in full safety, in full security, and to avoid excessive recourse to telework with the impact on being isolated, and preserve cohesion within the enterprise. It's this kind of system enables to make us stronger and more resilient. And when the political power is solid in its risk management approaches, there's less fear, less social tension, and potentially less populistic reactions. This can more easily be contained. And this risk-taking involves a good risk culture. So we are there to disseminate this proper culture. That's our role with the younger generations. And a new model of risk sharing. We can't expect, as I said, that the state should finance everything. And we're next, so we have to talk about economics. So the risk needs to be financed, and the traditional way of transferring everything to insurance doesn't work anymore. So everybody has to take his share at the different stages, the different tiers. The enterprise, what can it take on in his accounting system? And then use insurance coverage. And it's whenever all these sources have been dried up, that's when you can go to the state. And this system also works for smaller corporation enterprises. I'm not talking only for the larger enterprise that can save up some money to resist, to resist to the shocks. So it's important because here we're at the end, we hope, of the economic crisis. Patrick Artus was saying the next crisis will probably be of the sanitary or financial or cyber order. How can can we be prepared? Christine Lagarde was saying that we do have the right tools, but we have to revisit them constantly. We have to rely on risk managers who live on their return on experience and anticipating to update the models. But we all have a role to play in the reconstruction of these models and the integration of risk management with the youth, with the economists, with the philosophers, all together to build this new model. But what I'd like to insist on again is that when risks are properly managed and when we have an explicit attention shown to stakeholders, then the enterprise is responsible. Patricia, a little bit of law in all this. We have the proper analysis, we have the good tools. Do we have the proper legal environment? George, how can we increase the responsibility of enterprises in the ecological environment, social and economic, its role? And what will be the place, the stakeholders of this new and legal environment, of a new state of law? I will be a bit closer to the mic. I'll go against the tendency with a view to the optimism which is legitimate as we leave this crisis, because law is always a bit reductive, intricate, but often it's realistic and rigorous. So when it comes to the enterprise, so when you talk about enterprises, the expectation is the long term, like for all the actors of the social and economic world. Why the long term? Because of course, you need to foresee the future, plan for the future, but enterprises have been doing this for years. The management of time, the long term, is in the essence of the activity of the enterprise. When you see that Volkswagen announces that by 2035 they will end the building of thermal models to the benefit of electrical model. When you see that in terms of communications, that's newer, that the new director of a great French group announces that his group will have 3 decades of growth ahead of it, and increases the stock exchange rate by 3%. So we see what it means. When you talk about the long term, it's the urgency. Why? And being aware of the long term. The economic actors, the salaried workers, the stakeholders are also waiting to be reassured on the future, notably when it comes to crisis or sanitary crisis, but also to be able, through the present, to be able to envisage prevention and so on and so forth. And when it comes to this, there are several expectations. The three expectations, to be brief. First, legibility of all this, of the expectation and responsibility of the enterprise, and the third expectation, which is a better governance, a negotiated governance that is chosen and shared. So on the first expectation, better readability, the salaried workers and all the stakeholders want to better understand the economic models. The economic models are not always well understood, especially at the eve of the ecological transformation, carbon, and also all this. Very few are the people who know the weaknesses or strong points of an economic model. Amazon is better known than the major industrial groups which are faced with technological stakes or challenges or climate challenges. There are two limits to this. The finance, the market is the market and the regulators hate protective measures, but communications on the fact that 3 decades of growth ahead of us with stock exchange value that increased by 3%. There was a very exact, precise information given to the market. So there's a need for a better readability, legibility of them for the long term, accompanied with a change of the rules of communication, financial communication. And the other limit is related to competition. The enterprises, their growth strategy, external growth, development of patents, innovation, diversification. They cannot be delivered to competition. even if they're not necessarily business secrets, but they're essential elements. There's a need of better legibility, evolution in time, and also of the limits. We can't deliver or give away all our knowledge. And the second expectation is the expectation on the expansion of commitments and social responsibility, environmental responsibility of enterprises. And now we knew, we know the European doctrine on the social responsibility, and with a law in May 2019, there was a great progress made. The classic translation of the social interest with the civil code, legal code for the decades and even a century were transformed by adding in the social interests that taken into account of social and environmental stakes. So obviously it's a new paradigm, and today's managers, today's corporate heads, and the stockholders must, in their strategy, include the social and environmental stakes. It's a key issue. There's more than that yet, and some will see some possible outlays of an enterprise with the reason of being of an enterprise. So there's a lot of plans that an enterprise can adopt a reason of being. That is the way the company sees its social role beyond its simple economical role. From that point, obviously the reason of being, and several enterprises have created one, as a degree of interest and of different sometimes the reason of being is an image as a communication purpose. The enterprise drafts a reason of being, but doesn't integrate in the statutes. And from that standpoint, since the reason of being is not included in the statutes, it doesn't create a commitment. It's not part of the founding agreement, and so its impact with third parties or on its responsibility, social responsibility, is an illusion. It's on paper. It's an image. It's not very much in the responsibility. But there's an additional degree that is the reason of being, which is included in the statutes. It includes the founding pact agreement, but also the founding members, all the stakeholders have their word of say. Have a say, but it's something that is sort of like a wishful thought. It's virtuous, but as far as the responsibility itself, it doesn't prolong the action or the policies to implement. It's just an intention, the declaration of value, the enterprise asks for value, this or that and that. But there's an additional approach or action, and that is an enterprise with a mission. The mission is more than that. It means that within its statutes, the enterprise adheres to a mission it defines, and that is often related to a reason of being, of course, but it's extended by a policy, a mission policy based on the sustainable development objectives that is called ODB in the United Nations, and that is the obligation to implement them. Generally speaking, they do it, they implement them, they have a committee to follow up the mission. They report to the General Assembly. The staff members undergo training. There's a real policy, a real implementation of the social responsibility and environmental responsibility. It's true that very often these enterprises with a mission, some are eligible in the sectors of sustainable activities, public service missions, or service activities, waste management, infrastructure. And there's an enterprise that is remarkable to that effect, and that we talked about it. It's David Dion, long-term investor. They took over Suez very recently. It's an enterprise with a mission, a long-term investor, and they're investing over 25 years in infrastructure with missions and objectives. So that's a key point when it comes to the social environmental commitment. And the last idea, and I will just mention it, it's the stakeholders. The stakeholders, well, it's a trend that comes from the American culture, the stakeholder theory, and that is in the essence of the nature checks and balances. And from that point, there was a trend that wants that we introduce in the role of enterprises the interest of stakeholders, the integrating this as an impact. Why? Because first, it's legal. It's difficult to define the stakeholder. The stakeholder is not homogeneous. It's they have specific interests. They're not converging. So it's difficult to make it a single part. But the second consideration that why we abandoned this notion is that the stakeholders, since they have specific interests because they obey to different cultures, well, they tend there's a risk that they tend to be instrumentalized by the general management to the benefit of their own interests, and that's why it didn't lead anywhere. So all these virtuous values, and that's what Philippe Alliand said in his book on the role of civil society. It's difficult to go from virtuous theory to effective, because when it comes effective, it's difficult because it's faced with the theoretical analysis, and it fails generally when you move from emotions to effectiveness. Thank you. Quite a debate. So we'll now maybe open up the floor for questions. We see the code has changed. We're all looking for new rules. Yeah, questions. I'm sorry, we can't hear the questions from the floor if there are no microphones. I think there's a microphone in the room. I'm sorry, we can't hear the people on the floor. There's no microphone. There is a microphone, but they're not handing it out. I'm sure the answer will be given. The answer will give the question, I hope.
C'est-à-dire qu'avec l'explosion des inégalités, on risque d'y avoir avec une explosion sociale et des sociétés criminelles. Si on ne prend pas en charge de façon absolue.
If we don't take charge radically, massively, an important redistribution of wealth, we run the risk of looking like a world of before and even worse. So what you're saying is that the risk that should be taken into account is the disappearance of the human race. Madam, you have a question? Good afternoon. I'm wondering, we know we need to change, but to what extent do the actors, decision makers who can create systemic changes are working in emergency? I'll make an analogy with the U.S. You know, in the U.S., the journalists, some politicians always bring the U.S. at the heart of Europe, and they say, you know, they say they're going faster than we are. There was a more massive recovery plan, but you know, when you look at it, the U.S. were not really protected. Europe was really protected, or France was really protected. So they are starting again with a sense of urgency. Here, we're more apathic because we know the state is there. We were overprotected during the crisis. I'm wondering how it becomes counterproductive for a real change. Another question, or we try to answer? Yes, sir. Unfortunately, we have very little time. Very quickly, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. One specific question, the air transport, international air transport, was not visualized except for state subsidies for historical airline companies. Do you have solutions, ideas, practical ideas on that issue? So who wants to take the floor? Maybe, well, in Europe, the apprehension of the risk is reduced because we were spoiled. Oliver, on risk prevention, maybe, and Anne? Two risks on the risk. The risk is something cultural, deeply cultural. In France and Europe, in a certain number of countries, there's an allergy to risk. And just look at an American mother or a French mother watches over her child in the garden. Go play, get hurt. The French mother is very careful. Be careful, you'll ruin your pants. So it's from the beginning that we need to improve the risk culture. Regarding the U.S., it's true. That's what I tried to say 5 minutes ago. They're catching up over 40 years of destruction in the U.S., which explains why Bernie Sanders is talking about $6,000 billion for some number of infrastructure investment plans, even if everything is not exempt. But we have to remember that Sanders and Biden are working at the same time on classic or traditional infrastructure, roads, railroads, 4G, 5G, but also what they call human infrastructure, i.e. education, assistance to children, fiscal tax shelters to reduce poverty. And so to that extent, I think it's interesting. We'll need to see if there's a small bipartisan infrastructure plan. Maybe it's on the track. I don't know how many billions of new expenses, and the reconciliation plan. Maybe that'll be an enormous plan that will take into account this human infrastructure. Oliver, is the house burning, or are we looking elsewhere? Do we need to be reactivated? Well, the notion of risk culture is very, very important, obviously, and that's why I mentioned the risk. This will not enable it to develop new models or innovate. And one thing that can be worrisome is that we talk about these massive amounts of money that will be spent, invested, either for economic recovery, but we depend a lot on enterprises to do this, for this recovery. They have to have the means, not by throwing money at them, but giving the means to be flexible, to be agile, to ensure the development. I'm making a parallel with the cyber risk. To change from the pandemic risk. Well, we make announcements in France with astronomical amounts of money for the digitalization of enterprise, notably smaller enterprise. In these amounts, we don't talk about cyber security and the required investments. I think that if we want to properly invest correctly, we need to integrate investments through the mastering of risk, which enable a more serene development, taking into account the real risk. Patricia, we have 0 seconds left. Well, thank you. I will summarize and sum up. I'll talk with Victor Hugo and with Alexis de Tocqueville, who said in 1847 it would be a more profitable thing to do to organize the new world than to concentrate on the debris of the former world. So I'd like to thank everybody who were with us on this panel and try to determine in which society we want to live, how can we accompany the movement. If I would recall 3 words in our session, it would be risk, it would be responsibility, and it would also be the mastering of transformation, and all transformation, not only the enormous technological and scientific transformation that we will live through, but also the transformation of societies. I think that's through a proper mastering of all this that we will enable to create the world of after and to live happily in this world of after. And it presupposes that we accompany things, accompany the risks, and to speed up the momentum, because in fact the house is burning and it's important to do this. And if we want our democratic systems and that the scientific development, human development in general on the planet be sturdy and sustainable, we need to start today our world of after, building our world of after. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you all.